Testing, 1, 2. Is this thing on? We are live from the scene.
Yesterday, I did something no African leader has dared to do in decades. The voice was calm, but the room fell silent. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a rehearsed speech behind layers of diplomatic lingo. It was President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, direct, unfiltered, and staring into the camera like a man who had just crossed a line drawn by empires. Hours earlier, behind the closed lines of a secure satellite channel routed through Ouagadougou, Traoré had picked up the phone and called Donald J. Trump, the former U.S. president, now again a frontrunner shaping America's foreign trade policy. Why? Because the United States had just announced a 30% tariff on Burkina Faso's exports: cotton, gold, textiles. The lifelines of a fragile economy still healing from war and sanctions. This wasn't a courtesy call, it was a confrontation. A 23-minute verbal collision not just between two men, but between two worlds, one wielding global capital, the other clinging to its right to survive on its own terms. What Traoré said on that call, and how Trump responded, may rewrite the entire playbook for how small nations resist the chokehold of superpowers. This was no longer about diplomacy, it was about dignity, economic sovereignty, and the thin line between silence and surrender. In Traoré's own words, "We do not beg, we do not kneel, we demand fairness, not favors." The American side didn't expect that. The National Security Council was caught off guard. No African leader had ever bypassed the usual protocols to directly challenge Washington's trade diktats, not in this tone, not with this clarity. So what triggered this bold move? What news had landed on Traoré's desk that made his blood run cold and made him reach for a red phone instead of a white flag? And, most importantly, what was at stake for the 22 million people of Burkina Faso if he had stayed silent? Stay with us, because the next minute might change the way you think about power, trade, and what it means to be free. Ouagadougou, 6:43 a.m. the 11th of August, 2025. The sun hadn't fully risen, but inside the presidential security wing, time stopped. A red folder landed on President Ibrahim Traoré's desk, not stamped, not signed, just leaked. The seal of the U.S. Department of Commerce still faintly visible beneath layers of scanned ink. Inside 4 pages, marked confidential, outlined a sweeping policy shift, a 30% tariff to be imposed on all exports originating from Burkina Faso. No official announcement, no formal warning, no phone call, just a silent axe hanging over the neck of a nation that had dared to stand on its own. For 3 full minutes, Traoré didn't speak. His advisors watched. The silence grew heavier than the air outside, thick with Sahel dust. Then, one sentence, "They didn't even think we deserved a warning." This wasn't a trade adjustment. It was humiliation delivered not through diplomacy, but by omission. A sovereign African state treated like a misbehaving colony. 22 million lives brushed aside by the click of a pen in a building 7,000 kilometers away. To Traoré, it wasn't economics, it was a message, a quiet reminder from the Western order: know your place, Africa. But how does a soldier-turned-statesman respond when his country's dignity is tossed aside like scrap paper? And what happens when the insult becomes personal, when silence is no longer an option? Would you pick up the phone, or would you pick a fight? The 12th of August, 2025, 11:17 a.m. Ouagadougou time. The secure line crackled for a moment, then a voice came through. Confident, dismissive, familiar. "Captain Traoré," the voice said, "we're protecting American jobs. That's all this is." For a split second, President Ibrahim Traoré stared at the receiver in disbelief, not because of what was said, but how it was said, like a lecture, like he was a student in need of instruction. He'd called Donald Trump not to beg, not to bargain, but to confront the consequences of a silent economic war, 30% tariff slapped on Burkina Faso's exports, with no justification, no discussion, no regard. But now, the tone on the other end made one thing crystal clear. The former US president thought this was just another African plea for mercy. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't resort to slogans. Instead, he interrupted with a single sentence. "Mr. President, let me tell you about our economy." He spoke of Sarah, 23 years old, lives in Tangin district, northeast Ouagadougou, works at a garment factory sewing cotton t-shirts destined for US shelves. $182 per month. That income feeds her parents, 2 siblings, and a 4-year-old daughter with asthma. The same daughter who needs imported medicine, paid for by the wages earned from that factory. "If your tariffs go through," Traoré said, "Sarah loses her job, her family loses its only income, her child loses access to treatment, and for what? So you can say, you're tough on trade?" There was silence. This wasn't a speech, it was a mirror, one that showed what abstract policies look like in human form, hungry, breathless, and unseen. So when a world power shrugs off a nation's survival, who gets to define what economic security really means? The line had gone quiet for a second, just static. Then, President Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward and said, without raising his voice, "Mr. Trump, when your policies collapse our economies, don't ask me later why your borders are overwhelmed." It wasn't a threat, it was a forecast. And it landed like thunder on a call already soaked with tension. The conversation had veered off trade and into something far deeper: cause and consequence. Traoré had just painted a picture too real to ignore. A young Burkinabè worker laid off because tariffs made her factory orders vanish. A farmer priced out of markets because American grain was subsidized to undercut local harvests. A teenager with no future staring north across the Sahara. "You think migration is a border issue?" Traoré asked. "It starts here, Mr. President, when a young man sees no job, no hope, and no dignity left in staying. Burkina Faso, like much of the Sahel, already stands on the knife's edge. One failed crop, one trade shock, one cancelled contract, and you don't just get a protest, you get an exodus. A human wave moving through Niger, across Libya, into the Mediterranean, onto the shores of Europe. Don't call me next year, asking why there's a 10-fold rise in boats hitting Italy," Traoré continued. "You created that tide with every unfair policy you defend." He didn't plead. He warned with clarity, gravity, and a legal understanding of how economic policy becomes humanitarian crisis. Because when a superpower weaponizes trade, what recourse does a small nation have except to show the world what that weapon truly destroys? And when dignity is denied at the table, is migration not the scream of those forced to leave it altogether? The 12th of August, 2025, 11:39 a.m. Ouagadougou. A humid tension hung in the air as the final moments of the call ticked on. On one end, Donald Trump, former President of the United States, economic nationalist, master of the transactional. On the other, Ibrahim Traoré, 5-year-old leader of Burkina Faso, former soldier, now the voice of a continent tired of being harvested like grain. And then came the sentence that cut through every layer of diplomacy. "I don't want anything from you. I want you to stop taking from us." Silence. Trump didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. Because Traoré wasn't negotiating, he was testifying. With a voice calm but burning, he laid out the mechanics of an economic system engineered not to assist, but to extract. "For every dollar you call aid," Traoré said, "you've already taken 5, in debt interest, in underpriced gold, in trade agreements that force us to export cotton raw, only to buy it back as shirts stitched in Bangladesh." He called out AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a policy that the West parades as benevolent, yet locks African nations into the role of raw material suppliers. Under AGOA, Burkina Faso can export unrefined shea butter, but the moment they build a refinery, the tax barrier returns. "You don't reward us for growing, you punish us for trying." Traoré's tone sharpened. This wasn't theoretical, it was structural theft masquerading as partnership. "You build global value chains, we're chained to the bottom rung of them." He continued without pause. "Cancel the new tariffs. Remove penalties on refined African products. Recognize our right to add value to our own resources. And stop using aid as a leash disguised as a gift." This was no longer a phone call, it was a declaration, not of war, not of defiance, but of independence, of reclaiming narrative, agency, and the right to define progress on their own terms. Burkina Faso doesn't need pity, he said. We need the space to build. Trump had spoken for 12 minutes. This time he had no comeback, no slogan, no quip, just silence and the sound of something shifting. Because when the exploited begin to speak like equals, what happens to the order built on their silence? And if Africa no longer asks for permission, who, exactly, still holds the power? The 12th of August, 2025. 11:44 a.m. Ouagadougou. The room was still. A soft buzz from the encrypted comms unit filled the air as the voice on the other end paused. For the first time since the call began, Donald J. Trump had stopped talking. And it wasn't because of interruption. It was because he'd been challenged with facts he didn't expect from a place he didn't expect them. President Ibrahim Traoré had just walked him through a side-by-side comparison of America's trade policies, China, Canada, the European Union, tariff thresholds, preferential access, bilateral protections, even NAFTA renegotiations. He cited percentages, referenced timelines, named clauses, not from briefing notes from memory. Trump responded with familiar rhetoric. We've been generous with Africa. We've helped fight terrorism. We've sent aid. That's when Traoré struck back. You think we need charity to survive? His voice didn't rise, but the words carried weight. Mr. President, the biggest security threat in Africa isn't terrorism, it's economic despair. He didn't pause. When a young man wakes up with no job, no prospects, no future, he will look for a way out. That may be a smuggler's boat to Europe. That may be a militia offering food and purpose. That may be a gang preying on desperation. But it will not be silence. On the other end of the line, the former US president, known for controlling every conversation, fell quiet again. He'd expected a request. Instead, he got a warning laced not with threats, but with socio-economic realism. Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso anymore. He was speaking for the continent, for the frustration boiling in Dakar, the silent hunger in Bamako, the restless youth in Lagos and Niamey, and for the global consequences of policies crafted in rooms that never hear African voices. Why is Africa treated differently? Traoré finally asked. You respect China because they're strong. You listen to Canada because they're rich. What are we? Invisible? There was no answer, just breath. Then silence. Then something different. Listening. Because once you admit that desperation is the true driver of instability, what excuse is left for building more weapons instead of building more opportunity? And if leaders of small nations start questioning not just policy, but moral authority, what happens to the system built to silence them? The 12th of August, 2025, 11:58 a.m., Presidential Compound, Ouagadougou. The room felt heavier now. The air was thick with unspoken calculations, unresolved histories. On the encrypted line, Donald Trump had just asked the question that brought the conversation to a knife's edge. And if we can't find a solution, then what? Traoré didn't flinch. His response came with the slow clarity of a man not looking for applause, only truth. Then we survive, but the relationship won't. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table, but the words landed like a verdict. This wasn't a threat. It was a pivot the moment Burkina Faso stepped out from under the illusion of dependency. He continued, We have options. We will work with those who respect us, Russia, China, Turkey, even small economies that treat us as equals. This is not about ideology, it's about dignity. The message was clear. Gone were the days when Africa waited at the door, hat in hand. Now, Burkina Faso was walking through it, with or without Washington's handshake. And then, the final blow. I don't need you to be a hero, Traoré said. I need you to be fair. And if you can't be fair, don't expect us to keep pretending that injustice is normal. There it was. Not the language of diplomacy, but of rupture, of clarity sharpened by decades of economic condescension and policy theater. In that moment, Trump didn't interrupt. He didn't counter. Because even a man known for dominating every room could recognize when someone else had just taken control of it. And maybe, just maybe, he understood the stakes not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent standing at the fault line between submission and sovereignty. So when a nation stops pretending, what else begins? The line was still active, but the power had shifted. For 26 minutes, Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré had done something few expected. He stood his ground not as a petitioner, but as an equal, not as a dependent, but as a sovereign. Donald Trump had listened longer than most thought he would. The former US president, known for abrupt exits and transactional instincts, had gone quiet, offering only short replies and hesitant qualifiers. But Traoré had sensed something deeper. Not fear, not deference, but a pause. That rare moment when power finds itself uncertain in the face of moral clarity. And then came the closing line, delivered without pause, without theatrics, like a final chapter written not just for Trump, but for history. Africa doesn't need to ask anymore. There was no echo, no applause, just silence, the kind that follows the truth when it lands exactly where it should. We no longer owe thanks to those who take more from us than they give. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. The ledger of global trade, foreign aid, military contracts, and silent extraction is already public record in every community where raw wealth leaves by the ton, while clean water arrives by the drop. Traoré continued. Respect is not given to those who stay silent. It is earned by those who dare to speak. There it was not a demand, but a standard. Not a threat, but a threshold. Trump, to his credit, responded not with a rebuttal, but with reflection. Let me take another look at this, he said. No promises, no pledges. Just a subtle shift from dismissal to consideration. But perhaps the most important outcome of this call wasn't policy change. It wasn't the suspension of a tariff or the redrafting of a deal. It was something larger. Traoré had demonstrated that when you speak to power with dignity and informed conviction, even superpowers must listen. He wasn't reading from a script. He wasn't waiting for approval. He was delivering something closer to a new diplomatic language, one born not from dependency, but from balance. And with that, he ended with a sentence that will likely outlive the call itself. Power without legitimacy is violence, and violence without consent will always fail. In a world where narratives are often written far from the places they impact, where Africa has too often been spoken about but not with, this wasn't just a phone call, it was a reckoning. It was Burkina Faso saying, enough. It was Africa stepping into the room and saying, we're not asking to be heard, we are speaking now. And as this conversation echoes into policy rooms, newsrooms, and classrooms across continents, the question lingers. If a small nation can demand justice with clarity and calm, what excuse do larger ones have for pretending not to hear? Save this video. Share it. Leave a comment. What does dignity in foreign policy look like to you? Because this isn't just about Burkina Faso, it's about rewriting the rules of engagement, one voice, one truth, one nation at a time.